Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Berger. I'm the head of the Biodiversity Footprint Department at CDC Biodiversité. Welcome to this short presentation of the GBS. To start with some context on global biodiversity loss, if we go on the next slide. So on this slide, you can see the remaining biodiversity at the global level on the vertical axis. So in 2010, we were having only 68% biodiversity remaining, and we were losing about 0.27% per year, which would lead us in 2050 at 58.5% remaining biodiversity. And that's biodiversity defined as ecosystem health, so the integrity of ecosystems. On this chart, you can also see the limit, the planetary boundary for biodiversity, which has been defined as 72% remaining mean species abundance, a metric I'm going to detail later. And you can see that the boundary has been crossed. So we are losing biodiversity at an alarming rate, and we are out of the safe operating space. And the third information you can see on this chart is the blue line. So the blue trajectory. So that's the trajectory of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this COP15 in Montreal should have this trajectory for ecosystem integrity, having no net loss of biodiversity by 2030, so stopping the erosion of biodiversity, and then gaining about 15 to 20% of biodiversity by 2050. So we have this trajectory, and on the next slide, we can see that the tools that allow to assess the contribution of businesses and financial institutions to this trajectory. So that's the trajectory I showed was the global trajectory. And then how do business and financial institutions contribute to achieving this trajectory? So on this mapping, you can see a number of tools. You might be concerned there are too many, but actually the tools that exist meet different needs. That's what we can see here, because the mapping show in columns the focus areas that the tool address, so public policy, corporate and portfolio, so comparing supply options, product and services, and project or site level. And also in lines, you can see the business applications supported. And here we distinguished three business applications. So the first one is, if we go back to the PowerPoint and not the Menti, the assessment and rating by and for third parties with external data. So that's a very specific business application. That's, for instance, having companies being assessed by rating agencies, ESG rating agencies. So only a limited number of tools allow that. Then the second business application on the chart is biodiversity accounting for external audited disclosure. So for instance, that's the reporting for the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive of the EU or TNFD, and which can be audited by third parties, which require specific data collection, etc. And then all the other business applications are grouped here in biodiversity management and performance. The GBS, the tool we are going to talk about today, is in the top left. And so that's corporate and financial asset assessments in terms of focus area. And that's that can be used for assessment by third parties or for third parties. And it also can be audited. The second information interesting on this chart is that there are two main types of metrics being used by corporates and financial institutions. Metrics on ecosystems, so that's the two in green, and then metrics on species and the risk of extinction of species, and that's the metric in blue. On the chart, you also have three other types of metrics, but I won't detail them, and they are not the ones which are the most used by businesses and which are the most related to the trajectory I just showed on the previous slide, which is focused on ecosystems. So then the MSA, the mean species abundance, I'm going to detail it a bit later, but the interesting thing here on this mapping is you've got all the tools in dark green, which use the MSA metric. And you see that's the most tools use that, and that it covers all the different business applications and focus areas. Then on the next slide, the mean species abundance. So what is it? That's a metric so as I said, covering ecosystem integrity, the health of ecosystems, and it's between 0 and 100%. So 100% MSA is a healthy ecosystem, undisturbed. For instance, a pristine forest, an undisturbed pasture, that can work for any ecosystem. So that can also be a wetland or other types of aquatic ecosystems. And 0%, that's for instance, a lifeless parking lot. And all in between, you have all different types of ecosystems, more or less degraded. So for instance, a plantation is about 30% MSA. So the MSA is the metric of the health of ecosystems. You can understand it as a health bar, for instance, for ecosystems, as in video games, for instance, or the integrity of the ecosystem. On the next slide, so you've got the MSA in percent, and then you have a surface over which it applies. And so we conduct a spatial integration, and we end up with MSA square kilometers or MSA hectares, etc. And so a loss of 1 square kilometer MSA, an impact of 1 square kilometer MSA in the gray box, is equivalent to the artificialization of 1 square kilometers of undisturbed natural habitat into, for instance, a lifeless parking lot with 0% MSA. So, for instance, on the right, you have an example. If we convert a pristine forest into a plantation over an area of 100 square kilometers, the pressure impact relationships that we use tell us that the pristine forest is at 100% MSA, and the plantation is at 30% MSA. So that's the remaining biodiversity here. And so that means, for instance, 70% loss for the plantation. So moving from 100% to 30% over an area of 100 square kilometers, that's an impact of 70 square kilometers MSA of biodiversity loss. Obviously, we can also measure gains, and we can measure the remaining biodiversity, not just the impacts. On the next slide, so those two slides were about the metric, the MSA. Now about the tool, so the Global Biodiversity Score tool, the GBS. On this chart, you see at the top the methodological framework, and at the bottom examples of data that we can use. So if we start on the top right, that's what we want to assess, the impacts on biodiversity and the biodiversity state. And so at the bottom right, you see that we could use exhaustive ecological surveys to measure that, but that's usually very costly and technically difficult. So that's more accurate, but that's less feasible. So usually we use proxies, and the more we go on the left of the chart, the easier it is, the more feasible it is, but the less accurate it is. So on the right, it's more accurate, but less feasible. On the left, it's more feasible, but less accurate. So if we go to pressures, that's usually the right kind of data that we want to use. That's, for instance, land use changes by types and location in hectares, for instance, nitrogen, phosphorus concentrations, wetland conversions. Then we go through the Global model, and we translate pressures into impacts on biodiversity. The Global model is a peer-reviewed model developed by the PBL, Dutch environmental agency. If we don't have pressure data, we use what we call inventories data, and we use in-house tools that we developed to go back from inventories to pressures and then to impacts. So inventories would be, for instance, tonnages of commodities, GHG emissions, water consumed or withdrawn, nitrogen, phosphorus emissions. So inventories and pressures, for most people, you don't need to know the difference. That's the best type of data that we can use. That's emissions, tonnages, cubic meter of water, etc. If we don't have that, and we want to have that usually for companies, if we don't have that, then we use turnover and purchases, and we use the ExioBase database, which is another peer-reviewed tool. And we go back to inventories, etc. As I said, it's less accurate. Next slide. So the pressures covered by the GBS are in line with the IPBES, so the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity. So land, sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, that's the pressures of the IPBES. Unfortunately, in the GBS, we do not cover yet invasive alien species. We also do not cover on the right marine biodiversity due to scientific gaps. As soon as science will progress and have pressure impact relationships for that, we will include them. So I won't go into detail about the detailed pressures as we don't have time, and we will cover that in a webinar in January. But so the four out of 5 main IP best pressures and 2 realms, terrestrial and freshwater, are covered in the GBS. On the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk about 2 concepts that are critical. So the first one is about accounting of stocks and variation of stocks. For climate, we focus on the greenhouse gas emissions and not so much into the cumulated emissions from the past. For biodiversity, that's key to focus on that. So on the left, you've got a chart showing the situation at the beginning of a fictitious assessment. You've got cropland and pastures. So the cropland is not an undisturbed ecosystem. So you have negative cumulated impacts, and that's what we call a static impact. And then we move to the right. At the end of the assessment, the farmer increased the surface area of the cropland, and you have additional periodic losses, and that's what we call dynamic impact. So that's a variation of impact. So it's very important to look at both the stock of remaining biodiversity, stock of past impacts, and additional gains or losses during the period assessed. That's what allows you to compare to the trajectory I showed at the beginning. On next slide, so the concept of scopes. If you are familiar with the climate world, the GHG protocol, you are familiar with the scopes. So here on the chart, you see a logging company. Its scope 1 in orange is all the logging, the warehouses it uses, the trucks it uses, which are operated by the company. So that's scope 1, direct operations. Then we split impacts also by upstream impacts, which includes scope 2, so all the purchases related to energy, and upstream scope 3, so all the other purchases. And then we have the downstream impacts, so downstream scope 3, which is all the impacts due to use and end of life of products and services. So in the GBS, we distinguish scope 1, 2, and 3, upstream and downstream, which is also compatible with the natural capital protocol. And to conclude, before handing over to you for the questions, so please use Mentimeter to ask the questions. So what are the solutions proposed by CDC Biodiversité to measure biodiversity impact? So if you are a company, a corporate, not financial institution, that's at the bottom. We have biodiversity footprint assessments to assess your impacts. If you are a financial institution, it depends whether it's non-listed assets, in which case we use the GBS for financial institutions, GBS FI, which is more tailor-made. Or if you have listed assets, then you can use the BIA GBS database, so Biodiversity Impact Analytics powered by the GBS, which we developed with Carbon for Finance, our partner. It's off-the-shelf database, so you just need to provide, for instance, easy numbers and the amount invested, and then you get the impacts. We also have trainings at the B4B+ Club to get on top of this topic and meet other corporates and financial institutions and do case studies. Thanks a lot for your attention, and so happy to answer all your questions now.
Yes, thank you very much, Joshua. So now we have 20 minutes dedicated to questions and answers. So join the Menti, you have the code here on the slide, and you can click on the link directly and ask your questions. We will have 3 GBS experts to answer them today. Joshua Berger, head of the Biodiversity Footprint Department. We have Patricia Zhang, who is project officer in the team, and Sibylle Rouet Pollakis also, who is data scientist, and they both are working on the development of the tool. So they will be able to answer all the questions. I'm going to switch to the Menti. I think we have some first questions. Also, like the question that you want to be answered. If we have too many questions, we will select the questions with more likes. Okay, so I see we have some questions with likes at the end. Maybe one question about the first slide presented showing a decrease of biodiversity as a percentage. Can you provide a reference? How is this calculated? Maybe Joshua, you want to answer this one?
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
It's about the first slide showing decrease of biodiversity as percentage. Can you provide a reference? How is this calculated?
Yeah, so the percentage of 68% biodiversity remaining, this is detailed in one of our reports. We are going to put the report on the chat. And so this is the remaining biodiversity globally, and it has been assessed by the PBL, which I mentioned, the Dutch Netherlands agency for the environment. And this is based on satellite imaging and the assessment of the different pressures on terrestrial biodiversity. And it has been assessed. So for 2010, it was assessed in 2016. And it has been updated several times since then. And it's available, for instance, in the Global Biodiversity Outlooks published by the CBD.
Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. So this question has been answered. There is another question with 2 likes. What types of data can be taken into account by the GBS? Could we use ecological survey data? Maybe Patricia, you want to answer?
Yeah, so the GBS could take into account several types of data. So the ecological surveys could be translated into the MSA, but for now, we usually the companies do not have extensive data on this. So usually we collect data on pressures from the companies. So how much GHG they emit, what pollution they cause, how many land and what type of land they convert or they use. So yeah, the GBS could take into account pressure data or also inventories of raw commodities or transformed products they purchase or they produce. And finally, if none of this type of data are available, the companies could take into account, could collect financial data, so turnover or as well as purchases amounts. Yeah, we can send you also a reference with the types of data that the GBS could take into account. So it's in our latest report, and you will find all this type of information written.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. I think we have other questions. Maybe the one that was on the source of data about species abundance, maybe for Sibylle.
Yes, so we use pressure data relationship from the Global Bio model. So Global Bio has been developed by the PBL, so it's the Dutch Environmental Agency, and those relationships we use for building the GBS, and so that's where our mean species abundance data come from. So it all comes from Global Bio model.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a questions also about TNFD and SBTs for nature, maybe Joshua.
Yes. Can you switch another question, Manon?
So the question is, how does GBS fit with TNFD and CBT and SBT for nature?
Yeah, so the GBS, the TNFD, so it has a number of metrics currently being discussed. And so one of them is the mean species abundance for the assessment of impacts and related to transition risks. So the GBS can inform that. We have a number of pilots ongoing with financial institutions to test the TNFD framework. So the way it's going to work is for the locate step, you can use the GBS but mainly other sources to do the locate step. Then for the evaluate step, you can use the GBS to assess impacts using the mean species abundance metric. You will also have to use other tools to cover other aspects of biodiversity, like species extinction, for instance. And then you can also use the GBS for something we didn't mention, which is dependencies, because dependencies are reported in the GBS. So you can also have a look at physical risks related to dependencies. And then, so as you might know, in version 0.3 of the TNFD, the impacts are now required for disclosure, which was not the case before. So the impacts in MSA, it's not yet clear. The TNFD framework is not out yet, but it's likely that the impacts in MSA square kilometers are going to be recorded in the disclosure. So the GBS can be used for that. And so it's related to physical risk for the dependencies, transition risks for the impacts. And the SBTN, so Science-Based Target Network, yeah, it's less advanced at this stage for biodiversity. The GBS is listed as one tool to conduct step 1, step 2 on the assessment and prioritization. We believe it should also be used for step 3 on measurement baseline, etc. There are no guidelines yet, so that's our opinion. It's not endorsed by the SBTN. But so the GBS is one of few tools that can be used to assess ecosystem integrity for the SBTN. Again, not endorsed by the SBTN, but that's what we think. You will need also to use tools to cover species extinction. And we have been working on a number of assessments where we applied the SBTN framework. So that's not easy to do, but I mean, it has been done, and this is we have guidelines for that. So if you want to apply the TNFD framework or SBTN, please do contact us, and we'd be happy to help.
Thank you very much. I think we have some questions for Patricia. There is consultants asking how they can get trained to do such assessments with the GBS.
Yes, for the trainings. So I will send you a link to pre-register to the trainings. So to sum up, we have different levels of training. So there's a training about the fundamentals for the biodiversity footprint. So you could either do this training or or pass a test to know if you already are knowledgeable about this topic. And if so, then you could access to the level 1 of the GBS tool. So this is really for at the end of the level 1 training, you will be able to know what in detail what type of data should be collected by the company or by the consultants to do a BFA, and you will be able also to interpret some results. And then the expert level for the training, which is the level 2 training, the GBS. And at the end of the level 2, you will be able to really be autonomous on the GBS tool. You will be able to do the computations, do advanced result interpretation. Yeah, I will send you the different information on the training. So it's on. You could pre-register on this link, and also there are all the information about the prices and the duration of the trainings. Yeah. So maybe to detail, the level 1 is 1 day, and the level 2 of the training is today, and so we will have several sessions during the next year. So it could be either in French or in English, and if it's in English, so we also make remote trainings for more international companies, consultants, financial institutions who are interested in this topic. I send you the link.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. We had a question about the replay of this webinar. Yes, it will be it is registered, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So you will access to the replay, and the link will be sent to all the participants. You must be registered on the Eventbrite link of the event to receive the replay link. I think there was another question for you, Patricia, about the application of the GBS. Can the tool be applied to any type of economic activity, or are there some restrictions?
Yeah, so the GBS could be applied to, actually in the version we have now in the GBS, so we cover well the agricultural commodities, and also we started a few benchmark fact sheets about the different sectors. So we cover the agricultural sector, the energy sector, the building sector, and the chemical sectors are covered by the benchmarks. And so we developed commodities about the agriculture and crops, so crops and livestock commodities, the fossil fuels, so oil and gas, and also mining extraction sector. The forestry also are commodities are covered, and yeah, so we have done a review of the first version of the GBS. So in one of these, I will send you the link. So in one of these reports, actually there is an assessment of how well in the first version of the GBS each sector are covered by the tool. So so you will find the details here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think there is another question about what are the steps if my company wants to try the GBS. Maybe Joshua?
Yes. So the steps, first is to contact us and follow maybe the webinar, the longer webinar that we are going to have in January. And you can also watch the replays of the webinars in June, where it's more detailed. And then, so you can work either with us or with a trained assessor of the GBS. There are more than 10 now. So then we've got 4 or 5 main steps, which more or less follow the steps of the SBTN. So the first step is to define the perimeter, and that's actually more complicated than that you might think, because you can take a operational control view or a financial control view, for instance. Then collect the data, which takes about 3 months in general. Then conduct the calculations with the tool, and then assess the results, analyze the results, produce the report, etc. And then you have the next steps after the assessments of starting to act, monitor, etc. So you can also conduct the assessment yourself if you want, and then if you want to do that, the first step is obviously to get trained. So then register for the trainings. Those are paid trainings. Follow them. That's 3 days of training, 3.5 actually days of training if you want to conduct an assessment yourself.
Thank you very much, Joshua. There are questions on Exaiobase and GloBio. I think maybe Sibylle, you can tell us a bit more about that and the link with the GBS.
Yes, so let's start with GloBio. GloBio is a pressure impact model. It gives us pressure impact relationship meaning that it gives us the amount of MSA square kilometer associated with the specific pressures, for example, climate change or water use. And so it allows us to link the pressure from a company to an impact in MSA square kilometer. And Xeriobase is an input-output economic tool that allows us to estimate the supply chain relationships of the economy, worldwide economy. So it allows us to connect the economic data from a company to commodities extraction, and therefore afterwards to pressure, and then we connect those pressure to the global pressure impact relationships, and that gives us impacts in MSA square kilometers. But yeah, it's a very large topic. Xeriobase and Global, I don't know how concise we can make it, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sibylle. We are hitting the time. So thank you very much for joining this webinar. Thank you very much for the questions that have been asked. We will send the answers to the few remaining questions in the email with the link to the presentation and the replay. And also you are more than welcome to join our next webinars in January. We will put the link in the chat and also in the email after the webinar. So in January we will present more broadly the GBS ecosystems trainings and biodiversity footprint assessments that we can do, and you will have also some answers to your questions during this webinars. So thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure, and see you soon.